Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Downing Street has dismissed an attack by Boris Johnson on the Prime Minister's Brexit strategy, saying he's offered no new ideas of his own. The former Foreign Secretary said the plan would mean Britain will get diddly squat from the negotiations with Brussels and accused the Prime Minister of going into battle with the white flag fluttering. Mr Johnson resigned from the government in July in protest at the deal agreed by the Cabinet at Chequers. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports.
Did time stand still? Westminster is back to work and back to the same bitterness.
Theresa May is trying to stitch together a deal, the most important any government's done for decades, based on what she believes is a cool-headed compromise, her Chequers plan. The Tory MPs coming back from holiday are anything but calm.
There was only calm at Brexit's biggest cheerleaders' country pad. But Boris Johnson's criticism of the government's plan screamed from the front pages. He claimed it would be a disaster, and Britain is waving the white flag. Not for the first time, his antics made the Tory top brass sigh.
This is a plan that's been put forward by the UK government, and it's still being considered by all the different bits that make up the EU, and let's see what they say, but that's the plan.
Number 10's adamant Brussels can work with their plan, claiming Mr Johnson is not a serious politician.
Good meeting.
But being rude doesn't change the fact that Mr Barnier, as well as Brexit backers, think Chequers just can't work.
He and I found we were in considerable degree of agreement that Chequers is absolute rubbish and that we should chuck it, and what we should have is a Canada-style free trade deal.
Add to that, many former Remainers share that view.
The biggest problem for me is how people see this. The Chequers deal is now more unpopular with the British people than the poll tax was, and that is why it's untenable to take forward.
We are more than 2 years into this process, but it's far from over. Activists pushing for another vote sense things might go their way. And for Labour, the discontent in the Tory party is more evidence of the government's struggle.
There has to be a trade agreement with Europe and a customs union with the European Union to protect those jobs. Nobody voted to lose their jobs, and I think that if the government is incapable of negotiating with the EU, then they should move over and let somebody else do it seriously.
Despite the lack of love for the Chequers plan in Parliament, the Prime Minister has no intention of budging from her position. The view in Number 10, compromise might not be popular, but they believe they have put forward a serious and a viable basis for a Brexit deal. And their many critics, in their view, don't have an alternative that could work.
So the Brexit Secretary, you can almost spot, has to try to make it work, moving forward when so many others are trying to apply the brakes. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Westminster.
Talks are understood to be taking place at the Treasury over whether the Governor of the Bank of England could stay in his post longer than planned. Mark Carney is due to leave next June after 6 years as head of the bank, but the planned departure date would be just 3 months after Britain formally leaves the European Union, leaving his successor to handle the aftermath.
Moving on, the futures of both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn hang in the balance as politicians head back to Westminster after the summer break. The Prime Minister's Brexit plans have been slammed as a disaster by Boris Johnson, who said Britain was waving a white flag of surrender going into negotiations. And Labour's leader could face his own revolt from MPs if plans for automatic reselection of candidates are passed by his party. We'll have more on that in a moment, but first, here's our political editor, Robert Peston, on Boris Johnson's Brexit attack.
This was the Brexit plan, created from the blood, sweat and tears of the Prime Minister and the British Civil Service, which her cabinet endorsed at Chequers just a few weeks ago. But today it was ripped to shreds by a colleague who till July was her Foreign Secretary. Now, just a few months ago, they were on the same team. But today, Boris Johnson, in an article in the Daily Telegraph, wrote, the UK has agreed to hand over £40 billion of taxpayers' money for 2/3 of diddly squat. And he added, in adopting the Chequers proposals, we've gone into battle with the white flag fluttering over our leading tank. His Tory colleague, the former Brexit Secretary David Davis, agrees.
Boris has got a point. We have to be tough with the Europeans. We have to be more determined about it. And we have to have a very clear idea of what we want. Chequers is not what we want. It doesn't meet the promises. What we need is a free trade plus deal. And that's what we should be pushing for.
More worryingly, perhaps, for the Prime Minister, a Remainer who used to be in her cabinet also agrees with Johnson. So what should the Prime Minister do now?
In the election, when it was clear that the social care proposal was a non-starter, she had the courage to ditch it. She should now do that with the Chequers deal and spend the next several weeks not in different parts of Europe trying to persuade leaders on a deal that's already dead back at home, but actually working with Parliament to find a route through.
Now, in his attack on Theresa May, Johnson said her negotiations were as rigged as matches between these two, Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy, which you have to be a certain age to remember. And he said that the preordained loser would be the UK. So shouldn't the Prime Minister just terminate the current bout and start again?
Chequers deal's dead, isn't it?
The Chequers deal is a very practical and pragmatic approach to our leaving the European Union. That is a complex thing, leaving the EU. It's a very big thing. It's really, really important that we get it right. But what's been put forward at Chequers is a very good deal for our country to make sure that we can carry on trading in a good way with our close neighbours.
Back to work for MPs and Lords after the long, hot summer. They face the biggest decision of this Parliament, whether to back a Brexit deal, if that is, Theresa May can agree one, and if her party doesn't decide to chuck her out before the negotiations are over. Robert Peston, ITV News.
So 2/3 of diddly squat is what we'll get from Theresa May's Chequers Brexit plan, according to Boris Johnson. In reply, her office said that his criticisms were not accompanied by an alternative plan. So began the back-to-school Brexit bickering, which looks like it's fast developing into a full-scale feud between the Prime Minister and her former Foreign Secretary. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has been following the story.
In his article, Boris Johnson described Theresa May's approach to Brexit as a scandal. In adopting the Chequers proposals, he wrote, "We've gone into battle with the white flag fluttering over our leading tank." Theresa May's number 10 team rubbished the attack. They said the former Foreign Secretary had produced no new ideas in this article to respond to. What we need at this time is serious leadership with a serious plan. MPs return from the summer break tomorrow. Some pro-Brexit Tories sound even more determined than ever to oppose Theresa May's Chequers plan. Some members of the European Research Group of pro-Brexit Tory MPs are trying to come up with their own plan for the EU negotiations. It would be quite a distance from Theresa May's Chequers plan, further away from EU institutions, more like a free trade agreement, a lot like what David Davis, as Brexit Secretary, was trying to cook up in his own department. And those who want this plan to come out want it to be published in the run-up to Tory conference, in the hope that they can use Tory activists gathered there to pressurise Theresa May to come off her plan and onto theirs.
I think she can now say, well, look, people have had a chance to look at Chequers. The EU don't like it, the Parliamentary Party and the wider party don't like it. Let's look at Plan B. I do think there's still that smidgen of goodwill to give her that wiggle room.
She could hold on, even though her plan had been rubbish, thrown out the window and rejected. She could hold on.
Yeah, I think she could, because I think, as David Davis has said,
not with much authority.
Well, she's not got a great deal of authority now, but she's got great resilience.
Tories who backed Remain have also been rubbishing Theresa May's approach.
This is the deal that is now more unpopular than the poll tax. It has the support of around just 14 or 15% of the public.
You do need to have a plan B, and I think that we are rapidly approaching the point where either the EU is not going to give the Prime Minister a deal that she can accept, or perhaps more likely that the deal that she does accept doesn't get through the House of Commons.
There are currently 20 Tory MPs signed up to the Stand Up for Brexit campaign. They're promising to throw themselves in front of the Chequers deal train to vote against it if necessary. And that would mean Theresa May would need 14 opposition MPs to come over and get her up to the magic 320 that gives her a majority of 1. But if the pro-Brexit Tory MPs are right, and there are actually 60 or more of them ready to rebel against the deal, that would mean Theresa May needs 50 plus Labour MPs and other opposition MPs to bail her out.
The truth is we know that there are quite a number of my colleagues who are more hardline leavers who have already said they will not support it. And so I think that we all have a responsibility to come up with another plan that could command the support of a majority of the House of Commons.
His plan involves spending a few years in a close relationship with the EU, like Norway's, before moving to a more distant one. But the weeks since the Chequers deal was agreed by the Cabinet have seen some unity break out in the warring wings of the Tory party. More and more Tory MPs seem to agree that the deal signed off here is all but dead.
Gary Gibbon. Now, in a moment, I'll be talking to Conservative MP Andrew Bridgen, a member of the pro-Brexit European Reform Group and one of a number of Conservative MPs who have publicly said they'll try to scupper the PM's Chequers plan. But first, from Westminster, fellow Conservative MP Gillian Keegan, who voted to remain in the EU and supports the Chequers plan. But Gillian Keegan, and thanks for joining us, in what sense is the Chequers plan still alive?
Well, it's still the option that's been delivered to the European Union, and I assume it's the basis that the negotiations have been taking place all over the summer break with the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister and others. So in terms of the one that's been tabled, it is still the one that is there, that is being discussed.
But Monsieur Barnier has already said it's not a flyer.
Sure, well, he would, wouldn't he, as in the famous words. You know, the reality is you cannot confuse negotiating with signalling. What he's doing and what everybody's been doing for a long time, which must be driving the poor British public mad, but what he's been doing is signalling. And there's a lot of signalling about what will and what won't be acceptable, you know, that's different from the negotiation, and it'll be very different from the outcome of the negotiation. We do not know the outcome of the negotiation. We are second-guessing as bystanders who are not actually involved in the process. So what we need to do is leave the negotiation to those that are negotiating and get behind them.
But if those negotiations did result in the Brexit plan, in truth, there isn't the mathematics to carry it through in the House of Commons.
Well, again, that's signalling again. When you have a deal that, let's say it was similar to the Chequers proposal, because clearly that proposal does compromise and does consider the EU's position, but most importantly, it's a low-risk Brexit, considering the business, you know, the position of business, and also to keep business confidence. But let's consider that that's what comes back. If that does come back, then those people in the House of Commons, myself included, will have to look at that option or the other option, which will be WTO. And it's only when you have those real deals in front of you that you can do an analysis of risk. And of course, everybody has a different appetite to risk. And this is a lower risk Brexit. And I'm sure Andrew's going to come on and tell you why he would be a better negotiator. Yeah. And of course, he would have probably a bigger appetite for risk. And that's fine. But the reality is the Prime Minister has the responsibility and accountability for the decision. And she's decided that a lower risk approach that doesn't undermine business confidence is the right way to go. But that is also workable for the EU.
When her former Foreign Secretary says we'll get 2/3 of diddly squat for anything that the Chequers agreement brings out, I mean, that's a pretty tawdry state of affairs.
Well, that's his view. First of all, what is 2/3 of diddly squat? I mean, you know, it's hardly a technical term, is it? You know, businesses need more than rhetoric. Businesses need to continue to plan, to continue to invest, and to continue to make business decisions. 2/3 of diddly squat is meaningless. It's meaningless to a business. You know, so I don't think we can take, I mean, I certainly wouldn't as a, you know, I've spent 27 years in business, in car manufacturing, in banking and financial services, and in IT. I was aware of the complexity of the things that we're discussing now before I voted in the referendum, because you know, I've worked in these industries, and I'm pretty sure I'm the only person who sat in customs waiting to get a stranded car part to keep a production line going, who's in the House of Commons. The reality is businesses don't work on rhetoric. They need some facts, and it is getting ever closer to March. This is a deal that businesses on the whole would look at and think, you know, it keeps frictionless trade moving, right, but also, most importantly, does deliver on the key things of the referendum, which is ending free movement and obviously having our own farming and fishing policy, etc. Right.
OK, well, Gillian Keegan, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, as I said, Andrew Bridgen, very much an opponent of both the Chequers plan and Brexit, well, pro-Brexit in particular. What is yours and, well, possibly even Boris Johnson's plan?
Well, we think that the Chequers plan is very poor. I've been very clear. I wouldn't support Chequers.
But I'm asking what your plan would be.
I wouldn't support Chequers if the EU were paying us for it, let alone us paying £39 billion of taxpayers' money for it. I want a Canada plus free trade deal.
Which to our viewers means?
A free trade deal where we have mutual acceptance of standards. We don't take the common rule, but we won't be under the EU regulations. A deal that the EU have done with Canada and recently with Japan. And the difference is that neither of those countries paid any money for those free trade deals. It will be the easiest free trade deal ever done in the world. We have exactly the same standards currently because we're in the European Union. It's only a matter of agreeing with Mr. Barnier what he wants tariffs on. We want no tariffs at all. We want totally free trade.
Well, the boss of the WTO, Mr. Azevedo, who seems to know a thing or two about negotiating entry into the WTO as a process, says it's no walk in the park. There are many layers of agreement, quote, and it will be no straight deal.
Well, talking about having a free trade deal with the European Union, most free trade deals, the big stumbling block is mutual acceptance of standards, a level playing field. But we go in, for the first time, any free trade deal in the world, we have exactly the same standards of the European Union because we're in the European Union.
Are you against a no deal?
I'm not against no deal. No deal is not as scary as people are made out. It's not no deal. It's WTO.
It's falling off a cliff.
It's
a massive shortage of medicine.
It's WTO. They're rules that we help to write. It's the way we trade with most of the world. It's the way that our exports are growing the fastest on WTO rules. It's nothing to be scared of. 20% of our food now comes in under WTO rules.
To fall off a cliff.
And they won't be. That is rhetoric. It's like the Millennium Bug. This is all hype. I've spoken to the ports. There is no problem with moving to WTO and importing goods, except for Dover, because you turn up and go, and they will need to change their business model.
I'll visit that upon you when this happens, and if there is anything like that to be seen. Now, Boris, if you had the choice, would it be Mrs. May or Boris Johnson you'd like as Prime Minister?
What I'd really like is Mrs. May to drop Chequers and go to the free trade deal I'm looking for.
So you're still confident in her leadership?
I've put a letter of no confidence in. That's public knowledge. That's because Theresa May's backing the Chequers proposals. They're so unpopular. They're only supported as a good deal by 11% of the electorate. That can't happen. It's not tenable. It's not a tenable position.
How many of the electorate support Boris?
And it won't go through. Well, there was a poll out yesterday saying it was 25% more than Theresa May to deliver Brexit. But that's because of the Chequers proposals, which are deeply unpopular. I've always been of the opinion that we need a Brexiteer to deliver Brexit. You've got to believe in Brexit to deliver Brexit.
Andrew Bridgen, thank you very much for joining us.
Brace yourselves, it's going to be an interesting few months. Politics is getting back into the swing post-summer, and the Brexit debate is reaching a crescendo. The Prime Minister's Chequers plan is losing support. That's the one that had us right outside the single market for services, but tied into the single market for goods, and with a complicated customs plan to avoid border taxes. This morning, Boris Johnson called it the fluttering of a white flag, and Remainer Tories are sceptical too. Yesterday, Tory MP Nick Bold suggested we scrap it and temporarily park ourselves in the European Economic Area while working out what to do. And then Labour, well, its position is far from settled. So decision or indecision, history will be made in coming months as we test the limits of our political party structure and try to agree a Brexit plan. All over Westminster, people have been trying to draw tree diagrams as to the scenarios that might play out. There are far too many outcomes for us to plot through them all, but all of them are momentous. If nothing happens between now and March 29th, we crash out of the EU. That fuse was lit in March 17.
So the ayes have it, the ayes have it!
When Theresa May invoked Article 50. Make no mistake, despite the rhetoric, no deal is probably the Prime Minister's worst nightmare. And a massive denial of Brexiteer promises. So the big question is, can it be avoided? Well, prepare for your excitement in two stages.
First, there's the Brussels round. Can we reach a deal there?
Short answer, yes, a deal is feasible. Longer answer, not without a mind-blowing climb down by someone. We could go full Norway at one extreme, further than Norway, inside the customs union, inside the single market, tied to the EU. At the other end, we could go full Canada, inside neither, arm's length to the EU. But both those options raise a problem for one side or the other. Neither seems likely.
The most plausible deal is a halfway house. Not Chequers, but Chequers Plus. For goods, we go inside the single market and a customs union. For services, we stay right outside. Boris Johnson hates any Chequers-type deal, but Chequers Plus would sort out Northern Ireland and keep us trading with Europe.
Unfortunately for Theresa May, it would be a humiliation. She's long been against any kind of customs union. Fortunately for her, if she can stomach the plan, some big member states are willing to take it very seriously.
But that still leaves round 2 of this game, the tougher one, Parliament. If there was no deal, expect turmoil, uproar among a large group of MPs. And if there is a compromise deal, well then expect turmoil from another group. You know the kind of thing.
The ayes to the right, 319. The noes to the left, 316.
Either way, there will be angry discontents who'll do anything to upset things.
The fact Theresa May has to face is that without a majority, it only takes about a dozen Tory rebels to create havoc. She has to satisfy almost all her Remainers and Brexiteers and the DUP or the Labour Party, or she's in trouble. And if there is trouble and turmoil, who knows where it could end? A confidence vote, a new government, a national government, another general election, or even a second referendum.
So, deal or no deal, parliamentary turmoil, that's what we're facing, folks.
Unless, could the indefatigable Prime Minister actually manage to both get a deal in Brussels and get it through Parliament?
Not impossible, but it would be a remarkable outcome.
So we could cruise to no deal or to a deal, but there's a stronger chance of turmoil and who knows what. The problem for Chequers, or Chequers Plus Customs Union, or any form of Chequers at all, is that it is an attempt at compromise, while the Brexit and Remain tribes are in no mood to give up fighting for their cause. Now, of course, there is another route, the fudge, and maybe that's where all this will go. A delayed Brexit, or a Brexit with only a vague idea of what Brexit means, or a temporary soft Brexit while we work out what to do. But any fudge leaves Brexit unresolved. Let's first focus on the search for a deal with the EU. Now, I'm joined by the chair of the Exiting the EU Select Committee, Hilary Benn, who has just returned from meeting the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, today, and also Alexandre Holroyd, who represents French people living in the UK for President Macron's party En Marche. Alexandre, you have been travelling with President Macron.
I have.
There seem to be some sort of mixed messages. He wants to make a special effort to keep the British close to Europe, and then other times it's all tough talk. What is his thinking on Brexit at the moment?
I don't think there are mixed messages. I think the messages have been very constant, actually, through the whole period. There's a real desire, and it's a desire which is shared by, at least on this trip, all the EU 27 politicians that we've met, to find a deal with the UK. But there is an iron-cast commitment to ensuring that that deal doesn't undermine the single market. And that's really the key position. The single market is based, it's an ecosystem, which is based on a set of rules. And whatever the deal is, it cannot undermine that set of rules, which all the member states, the 27, have all agreed they want to protect.
So can we be clear? Chequers, they've said no to Chequers. Hilary Benn, they've said no to Chequers, more or less, right? I mean, they're too complicated on the customs side anyway, right? I mean,
yes, Michel Barnier was very clear today in the interview he gave and in what he told us, that the facilitated customs arrangement, which is very complex, basically political construct to get around the difficulties in the cabinet, is not a runner, nor is a common rule book. And that creates the problem, because what does the Prime Minister then do? And one option is to say, OK, we'll accept that we'll need to stay in a customs union. And the other is what the European Union has said we're prepared to offer from the start, which is Canada. But all free trade agreements involve some checks at some borders, which brings us to Northern Ireland.
But can I just be clear? So Chequers plus customs union, you don't think is on offer either, because the common rule book doesn't work for the EU?
Well, a customs union is on offer, but that is not something the government is prepared.
But if we wanted to sign up to goods, common rule book, and a customs union, you don't think that's on offer?
Well, it depends what would happen on services,
it
gets very complicated because there are goods where the rules on services and the single market rules have to come into play.
Alexandra, if Canada came along and said, look, we'd like to have all your rules for all our goods, remove all the borders, and we'll be in a customs union, the EU wouldn't say, oh no, you can't do that, that breaks the integrity of the single market. That would be bonkers, wouldn't it? I mean, if Britain really made that offer, the EU should snatch that, shouldn't they?
The point here is that the Chequers plan is a great starting point for a conversation, and I think it's been recognised throughout the EU as a starting point for a conversation and a good starting point for the conversation.
But what's the end of that conversation?
You cannot,
what is the end? Because you've already said no to it, and you've said no to that, to the common rule book. So what is the end of that conversation?
There are a lot of options open in between, but there are things which don't work practically. For instance, it's very difficult in our world today, where your mobile phone, 40% of its value is services, to split services and goods. We're not selling chocolates either way.
So basically, Chequers plus customs union, you're saying, isn't on offer. So what is on offer? Canada, if we give away Northern Ireland, because the Northern Ireland border needs to be resolved. I mean, Hillary, what is it? What are the options? What is the menu here from which our conversation is going to be making us?
Well, a starting point would be finally for the government to accept, which it should. We need to go and say we'd like to stay in a customs union, because it created this very complex construction in order to avoid having to do that, but it's not.
Doesn't solve Northern Ireland.
It's not going to work.
Doesn't solve Northern Ireland on its own.
It's the
halfway to Northern Ireland.
It is halfway to Northern Ireland.
So what is on offer? What is on offer?
What, from the European Union?
Yeah. What is the menu of options?
They've said, look, if you wanted a customs union plus EEA, that would be okay. Right. And if you want to take Canada, well, then we can offer you that. That's what's on offer.
But you can't. You have to take Northern Ireland out of it if you go for Canada.
Northern Ireland's problem cannot be solved if you go for Canada, and that's why Canada is not an option, because all free trade agreements involve some checks on some borders.
Alexandra, is there any option? Here's the question. Is there any option on offer which allows Britain not to have free movement of people and allows Britain, of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland and Great Britain, to remain one trading rule book zone?
So I think that the way to see it is the other way around. At the beginning of this process, both parties set a number of red lines. And if you follow those red lines to the very end, you end up with a set of choices. But in between those choices, if you were to give up some of those red lines, you would have to find a solution where, but the very important point here is where the obligations match the benefits.
Right. So
and that's the key point here. What you cannot have is you cannot have the benefits of Norway with the obligations of Canada. That just doesn't work.
Really simple question. Is there any option, forget our red lines, if we gave up all our red lines, is there an option which allows us to say we don't want free movement and we don't want Northern Ireland to be a separate part of the UK for trading purposes? Is there any option? Canada, no.
No.
Chequers plus customs union, you've said, is not on offer. And the single market EEA option, customs union plus single market, has free movement. So you're basically saying you've got to either give up Northern Ireland as part of the UK economy, or you have to have free movement. Is that right?
Well, I think it depends on whether, because we haven't even asked, whether the EU would be prepared to do something on the subject of free movement. Because after all, they want money from us, not just the money we're paying for leaving, but the question of whether there might be continuing contributions. As recent events have demonstrated, they're going to want some kind of agreement on fishing rights.
Would Macron entertain anything on free movement? Because that must break the integrity of the single market, which you said is your red line.
The integrity of the single market is the main unifying factor of the 27 and the main sort of standpoint of the EU 27. So that's clearly not going to happen. But in December, we proposed a backstop. In December, we proposed a backstop as a back option. And then we said to the UK, we said to our partners, if you find something better, if you find something more creative, come back to us. And we're willing to examine anything you propose. And so that's what we're waiting. But we do have a backstop solution that's been offered. And
do you remotely think, Alexandra, that the backstop, which involves a border down the Irish Sea, in which the EU's external border with the rest of the world is within the United Kingdom, with foreign officials Do you actually think that is a sort of a serious offer to the UK?
I think that's why it's a backstop. That's why it's a backstop. But the weight of the proposal lands on the UK. The UK has to offer a system which makes it work. And there is a backstop that we've offered. But we've said continuously since the very beginning, we're very open-minded about anything that you can propose which functions.
Gents, thanks both very much indeed. Well, look, let's take stock of the choices with a clutch of Newsnight's own team. Editors Helen Thomas is the business editor, Mark Urban is our diplomatic editor, and Nick Watt is, of course, our political editor. Mark, let's start with you. The British government's handling of this, I suppose you go back over 2 years. Is it working?
Well, I mean, look, they've always hoped that there would come a moment, particularly after the Phase 1 agreement, the initial issues, which was, in theory, wrapped up in December, where they'd start to be able to work away and get some of the more friendly member states more activated in this. And it wasn't just them that thought that. I spoke to people in the Commission who said, we're really worried about what happens after that initial agreement. We think unity might fray, but it hasn't frayed for all sorts of reasons, some of which you were exploring there. But one of them, and I think one should never forget it, is that in a way, the friendlier the country, and there are quite a few, you know, from the V4 to the Baltics to Austria, where I was last week, you know, there are quite a few, the less they want Britain to go. And at some level, even at this point, they still buy the idea laid out very early by Donald Tusk, that if you offer a really bad deal, you might still, at the late stage, be able to stop Brexit.
Helen, let's talk about business, because basically their message hasn't changed in the last 2.5 years, really.
No, not really.
Is it evolving, though? Is it
well, changing? I mean, the position is largely unchanged. So the bottom line is avoid a no-deal outcome and end up, through whatever means, reasonably close to the status quo in terms of frictionless trade and so on. What has changed is that it's all now getting a bit real. So you've got more contingency plans being activated. That obviously comes with a cost. Bigger companies who've done a lot of work on this are sending letters to suppliers and consultants and so on, asking about Brexit readiness. So it's forcing the issue to more small and medium-sized businesses. And given the state we now find ourselves in, you're starting to see people think about not just disruption in March, but what happens between now and March. So do you start to see an impact on the economy in terms of confidence? Do you start to see real market turbulence? Because actually markets have been pretty calm.
Currencies might start.
And also financing. I spoke to one big advisor that's telling their clients to take a really detailed look at financing, because they think there are certain structures where uncertainty will start to affect the availability and the pricing that's on offer.
Nick, we've been discussing the Europeans, we've heard from business. We really have to turn the corner now into politics, because the parliamentary process, I mean, it's going to be hard enough, as we've been hearing, to get any kind of deal that, you know, hardly that MPs can sign up to, but very difficult to see how anything gets through Parliament. Talk us through the politics.
Well, look, here's an interesting vignette. You were talking there about whether Chequers would have to change, Chequers Plus, and it's interesting, over the weekend, the Prime Minister talked about how she'd only compromise in the national interest, so maybe there's a compromise. And I've been speaking to an interesting Brexiteer, David T.C. Davis, not to be confused with the former Brexit Secretary, who is offering crucial support for Chequers. And he told me he is doing this on the basis of a one-to-one conversation eyeballed with the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, who told him Chequers is the final offer. There will be no further changes other than, he told him, tampering around the edges. Now, on the basis of that conversation, David T.C. Davis is supporting the Brexit Delivery Group. That's designed to bring Brexiteers and Remainers together to support Chequers. If Gavin Barwell's word is broken, David T.C. Davis is off, back with Boris Johnson, and that would probably mean the end of that Brexit Delivery Group. So look, today I've been looking at how the Chequers plan is faring.
Well done.
2 years after the
Very
people
good.
delivered their verdict, Theresa May delivered her plan. The Chequers blueprint provides the only firm foundation for the final phase of Brexit negotiations in the Prime Minister's eyes. But now Chequers finds itself on shaky ground. Theresa May's house of cards could come crumbling down around her as it is assailed from all sides,
Brexiteers, Remainers and Brussels. The first threat came within days of the Chequers cabinet meeting, when two of the supposed architects of Brexit abandoned the House. Now Boris Johnson and David Davis are inspiring a Chuck Chequers campaign on the grounds that it would tie the UK too closely to the EU.
I think the view of many of us is that the Chequers proposals are actually in many ways worse than staying in. They would leave the United Kingdom in full regulatory alignment on goods with the European Union. We would be obliged indefinitely to follow the court judgments of the European Court. It is just not compatible with what we campaigned for and what people voted for, which was taking back control of our laws, our borders, our money, and crucially, the ability to have our own bilateral international trade agreements. Chequers is a very, very bad deal for Britain.
Chuck Chequers has a surprising new supporter, but an idea floated by the former Tory minister and Remain voter Nick Bowles to park the UK in the European Economic Area while a trade deal is negotiated has been rejected by Boris Johnson. A mild testing of the structures of Theresa May's plan is provided by growing pressure, mainly from the left, for a second referendum.
I think the ground is shifting all the time. So even since we sort of broke up for the summer recess, I've noticed at events I've been to, people coming up to me, not even party political people, saying, you know, can't we have another say at this? Can't we admit it wasn't such a good idea? Now we see, now that they've changed their holiday money and seen that the value of that is going through the floor, and we hear daily of EU agencies like the European Medicines Agency today, or even just companies, Panasonic in Bracknell, relocating to Amsterdam. They don't want to keep their UK base here. So I think the more people find out, I think there is a groundswell of opinion now shifting towards a people's vote.
Theresa May could be forgiven for wondering whether she should follow the example of Parliament and call in the scaffolders to shore up the foundations of her Chequers plan. But there's a quiet confidence in Number 10 that her proposal represents the only viable option for a negotiation with the EU that stands any hope of eventually being accepted by MPs. As one of her cabinet allies told me, no one anywhere has come up with an alternative that ticks the right boxes. Some of the Chequers fortifications are looking a little more robust as splits emerge amongst the Brexiteers. One passionate Leave campaigner is actually supportive, though this is heavily qualified.
Well, when I hear Boris, my heart says Boris is absolutely right. My heart is saying the same thing, but my head is saying that there is not a majority in Parliament for a hard Brexit. And in order to deliver something, there needs to be a majority in Parliament. Now, of course, it is possible, likely perhaps reading the papers today, that the European Union may reject this arrangement. And if they do that, then I think people will understand. If we then move to a much harder Brexit, a Brexit based on WTO guidelines, the rules under which we trade with most of the rest of the world, which are nothing to be afraid of. But I think it's important that we show how willing we are to compromise.
The Chequers plan is, for now, still standing after taking a battering from all sides. Its fate could decide Britain's place in the world for generations to come.
Nick, what there? Well, Heidi Allen is Conservative MP for South Cambridgeshire. She's a passionate Remainer. And Jacob Rees-Mogg is MP for North East Somerset, and I think you know is a passionate Brexiteer, chair of the European Research Group, Brexit Group. Very good evening to you both. Heidi Allen, I'm going to start with you. Do you feel Chequers is dead now?
I don't feel it's dead, no. I think Chequers hasn't been given a fair chance. And my view is it was, as most of us felt, an opening position. You know, Brexit ultimately was always going to be to the 11th hour negotiating piece of work, and that's what it is. It's a starting point. I fully expect the EU to push back on certain areas, and I'm sure the Prime Minister does too. She won't have been expecting it to be received 100% in agreement. But I think we need to give her a little bit longer to see, you know, October, November sort of feels the right time for me to see how the EU, not the media,
and how are some of my colleagues actually responding to it. Let's see what the EU leaders, and that's not just Michel Barnier either. Macron, I think, is starting to show signs of being more sensible, and it's they that we need to hear from.
I mean, it didn't sound that way when we were talking to a man who's just spent some time with Macron a few minutes ago. But look, your Remainer colleagues on the Tory benches seem to be giving up on it. This is the problem for Chequers is that nobody is very enthusiastic about it. Remainers don't like it because they'd rather something more Remainy, and the Brexiteers certainly don't like it because they want something more Brexity. So it's going to fall between the two, isn't it?
Well, welcome to the world of Brexit. That's the 52-48% absolutely personified in the Chequers deal. That's the whole point, isn't it? That the only way any of us are going to come through this is with a little bit of compromise on both sides. Nobody's going to get exactly what they want, but you have to start somewhere. And I think, you know, I don't speak on behalf of colleagues, but I suppose broadly on the Remain side, if you like, we're at different positions. Right. Along that journey in terms of whether we feel it's a complete non-starter or whether we're prepared to give it a little bit longer, and I'm certainly prepared to give it a bit longer.
And what happens if the Brexit side of your party managed to pull the Prime Minister in their direction and get her to change Chequers or to drop Chequers, as they've all been saying they want to do? What do you do? Do you carry on being a kind of a loyal backbencher to the Conservatives? I mean, what do you do if the leader of the party changes to someone who's... What?
I said, as I so often am, thank you for calling me a loyal backbencher, Evan. It's nice to hear.
No, but what do you do if a Boris Johnson becomes leader? I mean, what would you see your position as being?
I mean, all of this is so difficult, isn't it? Because it's if, and there are so many variables at stake. Certainly, your direct question, if Boris was leader, I doubt very much that I would be in the Conservative Party, and there are a lot of my fellow colleagues who feel the same. But I don't actually, you know, the Prime Minister has been pretty strong. I don't think she's about to be bullied in any direction, nor by any wing in our party, nor by Europe either. We need to let her negotiate and see what she can do. I mean, ultimately for me, if it fails, if the EU just can't find a compromise, I think there's perhaps some more wriggle room on our side around customs union. Maybe bringing services in, because that's a great big chunk of our economy. I think just goods alone is probably not going to be enough to safeguard jobs in this country. So, you know, if we can show some wriggle room, if the Europeans can show some wriggle room perhaps around free movement, right, then I still think a deal could be done. But ultimately, if we reach the point of, actually, no, tried our very hardest, no deal is all that's on the table, then myself and I suspect, well, I don't suspect, I know the majority in the House of Commons would reject that, and then we may end up in second referendum people's vote territory. OK, that's very, very clear, and thank you very much for that. Jacob Rees-Mogg, look, we need to nail this Northern Ireland problem, because you want a Canada-type trade deal, and I've never heard Michel Barnier sort of accept that he can give us a Canada-type deal without sorting out a backstop on Northern Ireland.
Like Hilary Benn, I was at the meeting with Monsieur Barnier today, and he was absolutely clear that Chequers doesn't work. There are two bits of it that don't work: the facilitated customs arrangement and the common rule book. And he said those were just incompatible.
So let's put that one aside.
So, but it's really important.
But because that's gone. So
Chequers is not going to happen.
Canada, your preferred option.
Why does he get to Canada? Why does Monsieur Barnier get to Canada? He gets to Canada because he says, if you're outside the European Union and your red lines are that you won't have the ECJ, and you won't have the single market, and you won't have the customs union, which is the government's position, and you won't have free movement of people, all you can have is a free trade agreement.
And he's been quite clear about that for 2 years, so we don't need to detain ourselves on this.
But it's really important.
Right. So the one problem, though, with Canada is Northern Ireland.
So how do you deal with Northern Ireland?
And Conor Burns today was asked about it, and he said, well, the Brexiteers will be releasing their plan in the next coming weeks. But we've had 2.5 years. We haven't got a plan yet.
The key issue here is how do you ensure that standards of goods going into the EU are met? Because on a free trade agreement, there won't be tariffs and there won't be quotas. That's been made clear. So it's an issue relating to standards. But how do we manage standards going into the EU now? We inspect them domestically. It's built on a system of trading standards and enforcement.
But you
so
said
the question is...
You just said a week ago you talked about...
I said nothing of the kind a week ago. That was
on Northern Ireland?
No, that was a video from 2 years ago during the campaign. That is not something I said recently.
Is that video old? OK, so it just re-emerged a week ago. I'm so sorry.
No, but it's quite...
So do you stick by what you said 2 years ago in the referendum?
Well, what I said then was the answer to a question, and the snip that went round on social media...
But you said it would be perfectly possible to continue with historic arrangements, which is when we had a border.
Hold on. What I'm saying...
in Ireland.
You've got to understand what the question was before you look at the answer. The question was, how do you ensure that illegal goods don't cross the border? But that happens now, that there are efforts to make sure that contraband doesn't cross the border. But that doesn't mean you need to have...
But it's hardly... do you think you can get away with no border at all? Because at the moment we have a common rule book and we have a single
yeah, but we have
tariff.
separate excise duties, we have a different currency, we have a different immigration regime. It's simply policed away from the border. A hard border means fences and patrol posts
now,
and all that.
You've said that Michel Barnier does not believe that.
What part of it doesn't he believe?
That you don't need a border. If you have different rules and you have different tariffs.
Does he say that you have to have a physical border? That's the issue.
Well,
or can
yes,
you,
I think he does.
Or
yes.
can you enforce the rules away from the border?
They think you need a border. They do not think they have remotely heard anything that satisfies the Irish border problem other than their backstop, which keeps Northern Ireland inside the customs union.
Is impossible because it divides the United Kingdom. So the issue is, for the £40 billion we're paying, is there an agreement can be done that polices the border remotely from the border?
And they don't think so. It doesn't matter what I think, or even what you think. It matters what he thinks. You're saying he's your buddy today because he agrees with you, Chequers is dead.
Well, he has enormous charm and sophistication, as you would expect of a man in his position. But I only met him once. I wouldn't say we're great buddies at this stage. But the question is, how do you ensure that there is an overall agreement? Monsieur Barnier has said that a Canada Plus deal is on offer. We have currently been asking for something much more complicated that nobody wants. There's a poll in the Telegraph tomorrow that I think says about 20% of people like Chequers, 51% against it. Nick Bowles doesn't like it, Justine Greening is against it, almost everybody is against it. And the one thing that needs to be done is some amelioration of the Irish issue to ensure that the border can be patrolled remotely.
What do you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, think the process should be to get to that, given that there is clearly a majority in favour of a softer rather than the harder Brexit in the Commons?
Well, Parliament has voted to leave the European Union, and any deal will have to be passed through legislation. So the question is there a majority for any fresh legislation? Because with nothing else, we leave without any deal. That's already in the law.
Right, we're in no deal.
So we're in no deal unless some sensible solution on Ireland can be met, which is ensuring that the border is enforced away from the border, as already happens, and that's the key point for excise, for VAT and for immigration. It's policed remotely from the border.
Thank you both,
Thank
Heidi
you.
Allen, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Thank you very much indeed. Well, does the nation know what is coming? Is the public up for a no-deal Brexit we've just been hearing about? Is it ready for battle? And how does a nation as divided as this one possibly navigate a solution when the only thing everybody agrees on is that they are right and the other side is wrong? Well, I'm joined by four interested observers. Faiza Shaheen, the Director of CLASS, the Centre for Labour and Social Studies, a Labour Party candidate in the next election. Businesswoman Nicola Horlick, Chief Executive of Money & Co. Danny Lockwood, Publisher of The Press, a regional West Yorkshire paper. And Kate Andrews is the Associate Director of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Very good evening to you all.
Good evening.
Nicola Horlick, do you think the public is braced for what is coming over the next few months?
Well, I think a lot of people are sick of all of this, are disappointed that we've got really nowhere in the last 2.5 years, and feel that they elected their politicians to actually come up with something, and actually we haven't come up with anything. And we're now in a very precarious and dangerous position.
Potentially heading to no deal. I mean, that was Jacob Rees-Mogg's last sort of, if nothing happens.
Totally disastrous if that happens.
Do you think the public are ready for that? Stockpiling of drugs? And, you know, I mean,
well, you know, who knows? I mean, when you have these types of things, of course, there's lots of scaremongering, and who knows what actually will happen. But it seems to me that if you ever go anywhere near the Channel Tunnel, any slight delay does cause enormous tailbacks. Right. So I think it is going to be pretty disastrous if we have no...
Where do you think the public are, Danny, on kind of, are they up for a fight now, do you think?
Well, I think there will be if democracy is circumvented and the EU's ultimate goal, which to me is to force political chaos, a second referendum, and hope to overturn that legitimate vote. If that happens, I think the country would be in...
Did the public vote for no deal? Because they were told it would be easy.
No, the country voted quite clearly to leave the European Union, and I think that...
52-48, we know that one. But did they...
Are we going over that one again, Evan? Because the fact is this, the people have now sat for 2.5 years watching all of these very worthy ladies and gentlemen tonight, talking themselves into ever-decreasing circles of going nowhere. And what no one's asking the question of is, what is on the table, what is being offered to us? Because the only two things I see are either, one, chaos and a second referendum and the hope that we will overturn that vote. I don't think we will. Or two, they bring us to our knees and force us to accept terms which are just absolutely unpalatable, unacceptable, and again would lead to civil strife. And I really think it's that serious. I think the people are sick and tired of just this whole very unfunny 2.5-year pantomime, and they just want now to know what is on the table from the other side. What is Michel Barnier offering?
I actually tried to ask that at the beginning, but it wasn't terribly clear, I have to be honest.
What does it matter that all these people are talking like we're talking when we don't even know what we're asking for?
Faiza, where do you think we are at the moment?
Yeah, look, I agree. I mean, we all agree it's a total mess where we are and we don't know what we're doing. It's 801 days since we voted for Brexit. We still have no idea what we're doing on the Northern Ireland border. We have no solutions to so many of the issues that Brexit brings up. We've carried on with this delusion over the summer that Chequers will work. Chequers won't work. I don't know why we're going over this again. You know, it's just embarrassing for us right now that this is where we are. And so, you know, it's incredibly disappointing for people. And I think some people are more worried about what's going to happen to their jobs. I don't think they expected a no deal. I think for a lot of us, a British attitude of kind of, it'll be all right in the end, but it's looking increasingly like it's not.
But your party's pretty muddled on it, isn't it? Your party's really not exactly clear.
Well, I think they've been clear on the customs union. And I think what's important about where we come from is to say, look, let's think about what country we want to see. These 6 tests about, you know, making sure that jobs are protected, making sure we're doing something to address inequality. And so once you take that into account and you work backwards to what the deal then looks like, then that's why we say you have to stay in the customs union, right? And that's not what's happening in this conversation. It's sort of like Brexit at any cost for the Tories. It's almost as if they're so ideologically wedded to it. They don't care about the impacts on jobs, on people.
OK, Kate, Brexiteer, but perhaps more pragmatic than Danny here. I mean, do you think a sort of compromise is desirable, achievable?
It's looking difficult. If there were to be a compromise, it probably would have been something like Chequers. The problem is if you go closer to the Remainers or closer to the Brexiteers, it's not going to get through Parliament. It doesn't add up. So the question now around Chequers, which I don't think is completely dead. I think it's looking difficult, but the question around it is, are you willing to take this, to leave the European Union, to have the opportunity in 5 to 10 years to diverge from Chequers, or are you going to risk that it gets worse for your side, whichever your side is? But, you know, obviously there's a lot of political ill will towards this proposal, and I do think it may increasingly be looking like a no-deal scenario because nobody does want to make those.
But no deal, we know that Parliament has a huge majority against no deal. Mm-hmm. So if we slide into no deal, with no evidence that the country want no deal, and no evidence that MPs who've been elected since the referendum want no deal, I mean, that's a tremendous constitutional
Evan, but the people
problem, isn't it?
The people throwing out the nightmare scenario now are exactly the same people who said we would have economic Armageddon on the 24th of June 2016. What happened? Nothing. We've got lowest unemployment we've had, we've got growth, we've got an economy that is functioning quite well despite the uncertainty.
I don't think anybody said it was going to happen the day after the referendum.
I think George Osborne did.
And the economy is like a supertanker. It doesn't just stop. No. You know, so it takes a long time. We haven't even left yet. So
I mean, there are some bad signs as well. Like actually, growth has been lower than expected, and there's been I agree that it wasn't the fearmongering that we heard, but there has been slower growth.
But look, how do we resolve this? How do we get out of it? Because Danny, you are totally against the second referendum.
Absolutely.
But if Parliament is paralysed and is running towards a course...
And Parliament is against a second referendum and has said so, and has passed primary legislation. Well, look, where's the problem? Because the British people, if you're sitting outside where I am in Yorkshire, looking down at all these people in this Westminster bubble, swimming around in their little goldfish bowl, talking nonsense to each other and getting nowhere fast, I think you revert to what happened on the 23rd of June and you follow the will of the people.
A parliamentary democracy, and our MPs were elected by us, and it's for them to try and sort out this mess.
But they
need to step up to the... Yeah, they're going to have to find a way of agreeing, aren't they?
Not
Because
just
we can't
agreeing,
have this
but
going on.
actually fighting for the UK position. To me, what's so depressing is how quickly people faltered away from this idea of getting a free trade agreement with the EU. Having a common rule book in the sense that you mutually recognize each other's standards, that you want to be able to trade, that you want to keep barriers down, that you want to resolve the issue on the border, but to be strong in that. And that discussion in the past 2 years just never seemed to happen.
We've wanted to have it. I don't think the other side... You can't bargain with someone that won't.
The mistake was triggering Article 50 so quickly, because that took away our negotiating power. Because
well, actually, I don't think it did. I just think the EU played a slightly better game at this.
I mean, I find it frustrating to blame the EU. It's just a classic position. Actually, it was on us to offer deals.
Yeah.
You know, you hear Boris come out today and say, oh, we didn't even try. You've been part of the cabinet for 2 years. Where was your plan? We've had people, you know, want Brexit for decades. Where's your plan? So I don't think it's good enough. I don't think we should just, resign to like blaming the EU again. I think we have to understand that our politicians have let us down. And for me, because Brexit isn't just about the EU, actually, for me, it's about a whole bunch of, a lot of people see it as a kind of, an act of anger, anti-establishment. There's evidence to show that austerity had something to do with the Brexit vote. For me, it's actually maybe we need to think we're going to come to a point where we need a general election rather than a second referendum.
Well, which party actually wants to commit to, a fundamental one pathway Brexit strategy right now? The answer is and certainly not the major two parties. Nobody wants to do that. I agree with you. We can't blame it on the EU. Frankly, a lot of the issues that are blamed on the EU are domestic policy issues like housing and welfare and all sorts of issues. We can't do that. But I think it would be.
We can.
No, I mean, I think we would be wrong to do that.
But let me ask, what about this option of the Nick Bowles option? Let's pause Brexit for a minute, go into the EEA, park there for 5 years at our leisure, work out the next...
That's wonderful. No, absolutely not, because whether you're going for Norway plus, Norway light, Canada plus, Chequers plus, we're going to go for the EFTA, we're going to go for the EEA. Well, you know what we're going to do? We're going to kick it into the long grass until everybody's died an old death in poverty. This has got to happen within the timescale, and it's got to be a two-way deal, and that means something's got to come back. Michel Barnier, Jean-Claude Juncker, Mrs. Merkel, they've got to put something on the table that we can consider. It isn't just about us. It has got to be two ways.
What do you think of the pause, the EEA? Go full Norway, and then at your leisure you can try and find Canada in 5 years.
If the UK were guaranteed the Norway option for 5 years with a sunset clause, I think that would actually be very worthwhile to consider. But of course, that sunset clause may never actually set, and I think that is your concern, right? Well, you might have an election. Well, yes, you would have an election before, but even then, the terms and conditions and the way that it's framed would have a lot of Brexiteers feeling like Brexit wasn't actually going to be delivered. And I think there's a lot to be said that, when you ask your politicians to do something in such a meaningful way like the Brexit referendum, for them to say this is going to take 5 to 10 years is pretty ridiculous. They've had to and they haven't done much. Why would we be convinced they do much more?
I mean, a lot of the Canada deal took many years to achieve. But I mean, I think something to be said about what people wanted. There are a huge amount of lies that were told and delusions. And one thing that I think of, and when Brexit happened, I was like, okay, well, let's look at how we can get a progressive trade deal. What can we do here? And it just seems more and more as if this isn't possible to get something that will result in some economic empowerment of the UK, because our relationship with the EU is like scrambled eggs. It's unscrambling scrambled eggs. It's been a complete, in lots of ways, it feels like a waste of time. And I feel like there's lots of other issues
just about out of
to
time.
deal with.
I just want to ask Nicola, do you worry if there was a delay or if there was a second referendum, and I know you would rather like a second referendum, that the country would rip itself apart in the argument over it?
I think there has to be a second referendum because we're not getting anywhere. The politicians are not getting anywhere. We started this with... I don't fundamentally agree with referendums. That's not part of our constitution as far as I'm concerned. But that's where we started, and I think that's where we have to end, because we haven't had any resolution of the issue through negotiating through our politicians. Therefore, I think the people have to speak again.
Well, I'll be marching down the M1.
Thank you all very much indeed. It's worth saying that Britain is the same size economically as the 19 smallest EU states. So us leaving is like 19 of the smaller ones leaving together. That's how big Brexit is to the EU, and it's even bigger to us. Well, that is it for this Brexit special. Tomorrow we'll see Mark Urban's report from some European capitals, and we'll be following the twists and turns of this project as it plays out over the next few months.